Hello, this is the CUDA Open Lab seminar on February 16, 2026, and today it is our greatest pleasure to have David Stork, who is a professor at Stanford University, but also has, let's say, track record, which is absolutely monumental. He will talk about when computers look at art. And he is one of minimally four this semester who is actually, I think you could say your main foot was in industry, not in academia at the university. And there's a number of things which I just like to put on the table so people understand sort of like from whom we are hearing today. David was chief scientist at RICO and also at Rambus. That means there's a large number of patents and there's also a large number of papers, and a large number of papers, not like in the humanities, but large number of, even for computer scientists. David also wrote a textbook on pattern recognition, which was one of the sort of like leading first ones before the wave of deep learning that we have right now in the 1990s, second edition 2000. He also was very early in analyzing paintings with computers. You could argue he was the first one, sort of in the same generation as Ingrid Daubetschis, who computer scientists among you may know because of the wavelets, but she also does art. And also David did something that I find really amazing, which is he wrote a book on HAL's legacy, which is sort of like the big question is like, how realistic is HAL? From 2001 Odyssey in Space, forward by Arthur C. Clarke. And I think one can say you could easily spend half a day in your Google Scholar list and always find things which are making it even more awesome. We like the physics of sound. We talked about that before. So there's absolutely no chance that I will summarize the career of David in a sort of like justifying manner. I think we should just let him take it away. David, stage is yours. When computers look at art.
Well, thank you, Max, so much, and thank you all for coming. It's always a great pleasure to discuss this topic. I was in Tallinn about 10 years ago and really enjoyed the city on my way back from giving a plenary talk on the HAL 9000 computer at a conference in Sweden. And so it's great to be back in Tallinn, at least virtually. Anyway, I'd like to talk about when computers look at art. And I've worked in computer vision and pattern recognition for many, many years, decades. And it has revolutionized every discipline that deals with images, from medical image analysis, where computers are now more accurate than board-trained radiologists at detecting tumors and classifying them, to remote sensing, where computers, of course, are instrumental in recognizing different types of foliage and plants and livestock and so forth. Obviously, autonomous driving, facial recognition and gesture and pose recognition, even undersea, being able to recognize different types of fish, pose estimation and kinesiology, food inspection, computer lip reading. I wrote a book on computer lip reading, recognizing speech by not only the sound, but the sight of someone talking, architecture, and on and on and on. It's revolutionized every discipline except one, art history. And that's a little bit surprising because art, the images we find in art museums are some of the most varied, subtle, interesting, profound, and valuable images ever created, not just financially, but also culturally. And yes, finally, a few of us early on around the year 2000 started this field of using computers and pattern recognition and AI for analyzing paintings. And now the field has finally, after decades, literally, blossomed into a full-fledged discipline with university courses coming around the world. And I'm happy to say that I recently published the first book in the field. It's 785 pages, 1,065 images, Pixels and Paintings, Foundations of Computer-Assisted Connoisseurship. Here's the computer code on the cover that shows how you can analyze the lighting around the outside of, in this case, Vermeer's Girl with the Pearl Earring, to tell which direction the light is coming from. I'm also completing a new book, Principled Art Authentication, a probabilistic foundation for representing and reasoning under uncertainty, where, and I hope we will talk about it today, the fundamental change in, first of all, art authentication is in crisis. There are so many fake paintings out there. It's staggering, really. And I'm advocating the use of probability, where at the end of an authentication regimen, we come up with a probability that a painting is by a particular author. We'll talk about this today. Computer vision addresses a number of questions, but art poses new kinds of questions to AI that are not being fully addressed by, I'll call it mainstream AI and computer vision. The first is the issue of style, recognizing style, being able to see changes in style, being able to recognize an artist by style, a field that's sometimes called stylometry. We deal with small data sets. The revolution in AI with deep learning involves hundreds of millions, sometimes billions of images for training pattern recognition and segmentation and scene analysis. But the number of paintings we get from a particular author like Vermeer might be only 34. So we can't use, at least not directly or not without some intelligence, the kinds of deep network methods that dominate traditional AI right now. The next is non-realistic objects. Art does not have to be faithful to the physical world. And what do you do when you get watches that drip like honey when you don't have them in your training set? You don't have a billion images on the web that have these kinds of images. So dealing with this is something that traditional AI has great difficulty. Art is multimodal. By that, I mean it's a painting develops over time. This is Van Eyck's Arnolfini portrait with an X-ray of it. It shows how there are so-called underdrawings or pentimenti, where the artist first makes a design and then changes his or her mind and moves forward. Well, art scholars study these very, very deeply to see how the artist changed his mind and so forth. And that really doesn't get addressed in mainstream AI. So this is another new problem. Unphysical conventions. When can a bull take Europa across the Mediterranean? Babies with putti with little wings that can fly and so forth. They don't obey the laws of physics and they're not in your training set. How do we deal with that? Abstraction is a very important problem in art history. Being able to classify, recognize, understand it, and now even try to infer some meanings, simple meanings from abstract art. Again, that's something traditional AI doesn't deal with. Art recovery. Some of the most important paintings ever created were lost due to fire, flood, war, vandalism, and so forth. And is it possible to take surviving copies or preparatory sketches or verbal textual descriptions, and the other artworks by a given artist like Velázquez in order to recover some of the most important paintings ever created? And I and my students here at Stanford are working on exactly this problem. And finally, and I think this is the most important problem that art poses to AI, is the level of meaning. There's a branch of computer vision, semantic image analysis, where you try to describe a scene. Oh, there's a mountain with a man on a bicycle and so forth, which is a profoundly difficult problem, of course. But art goes beyond that. there's a meaning, there's an intention, there's something that the artist wants to get across. And can we get a machine to infer these deeper meanings? And I'll show you some preliminary evidence on how we do that later in my talk. And another profound problem, and this is the one I'm working on now, and my new book is all about, is the problem of fakes. As much as 20% of art on museum walls, is fake or misattributed. And it's not getting better. Creditable claims are that as high as 40% of art in the commercial art market is fake or misattributed. It is a profound problem, and I think computers can really help, and that's what my forthcoming book is all about. Okay, now I want to show you some of the tools that I and my students have developed to help art historians address their problems, their current problems in the history of art. And one is analyzing the pose of portraits. That is, of course, an important formal aspect of a portrait, whether it's profile or frontal or three-quarters or rotated and so forth. And traditional humanist art scholars analyze pose by saying, visually, they'll say, oh, this is frontal or this is profile and so forth. And it takes them a little while. And so most studies that involve portrait pose might have 5 or 6 or maybe 10 paintings analyzed by eye. Well, what if you wanted to look at the trends in pose in portrait over, I don't know, 11,000 paintings? You could never do that by eye. It would take grad students years, but you can do it by computer. And so we model the head pose by 3 rotation angles. If you're a pilot, you know about roll, pitch, and yaw, the 3 rotation angles. And we have a forward model where we look at the locations of key points, feature points on the picture plane. Where are the corners of the eye? Where's the tip of the nose, chin, and so forth? Here are just some, but we use more than this. And then we use deep neural networks to learn the relationship between the locations of those points on the picture plane and the 3 rotation angles. Now, this is all conceptual here in the right panel. We're not saying anyone takes a photograph or projects an image or anything like this. It's just the sort of conceptual forward model of a portraitist making a portrait. And I won't go through in the technical deep neural network methods. We use perspective and point. It learns these structures, or the fine-grained structured aggregation net. Again, I won't go into it. It's basically feature maps that get grouped into finer and finer subsets that give us a feature vector, and we learn from that. And anyway, here's the kinds of results we get. For instance, on the right, the Modigliani. You notice that it works. We're just showing the yaw, the rotation angle in the plane. But you can see the feature points that are accurately recognized or located, and then the rotation angles. And what this allows you to do in 15 minutes on a laptop is analyze, 11,000 paintings. And so here are box whisker, think of them as histograms of, in this case, just the absolute value of the roll angle for artworks in different movements: early Renaissance, Northern Renaissance, Rococo, and so forth. And this is very valuable to art scholars. Let's just look and compare 2. Ukiyo-e is the Japanese woodblock, the print style from Katsushika Hokusai and others. And then naive art, or so-called primitivism, is a Western period. I'll show you some examples on the next slide. But notice the vast difference in the mean, that little horizontal blue bar, roll angle, and the dispersion, the incredible range. And you notice that in ukiyo-e, you get immense range in angles. Heads are tipped a great deal, whereas not so in naive or primitive art. And here are some examples: ukiyo-e on the left, these are woodblock prints that show, in these cases, kabuki dancers in what are called mie poses. If you've ever been to kabuki performance, as I have many times in Japan, I go frequently, I'm going next month. There are moments in the kabuki play where the main actor, the man, will rotate his head and strike a mie pose, and the wood blocks will go clack, 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 clack. And pictures of these moments in the play are what the audience wants to take home with them. And that's why you see all these rotations of the head so dramatically. Whereas on the right, primitive art, like Rousseau and so forth, or even superb drawers like Matisse at the lower left and the five figures, are deliberately trying to be naive or childlike and so forth. And these are either untrained artists where capturing the head in rotation is much more difficult. And so the computer can pull this kind of trend out very, very easily. It also, don't have time to go into it, but you can look at the rotation angles in a given artist, like, Rembrandt over time. How did those change over time and so forth? So these are tools that art scholars like to use, partly because it's a tool for a question that they already ask and for a method, and they fully understand it, and they're not threatened by this, which is really important for getting computer methods accepted by, also call it the traditional art community. Here's another student project in one of my classes here at Stanford. Scholars of costume clothes like to understand how colors have changed and palettes have changed over time. So you can start with a painting like this, use a deep neural network, I won't go into it, to segment the painting and recognize where's hair, skirt, pants, belt, and so forth. And we use pseudo coloring just to identify them. And then it's a very simple image processing test or algorithm to extract those pieces that are part of the costume. And then we can do color analysis on this. We also use gender recognition. We're interested, and scholars are interested, in the different palettes for male figures and female figures. And so we use a deep neural network to recognize probabilistically whether this figure is male or female. And notice that in this case, it's only, I mean, it's a 92% chance it's a male. The hair is somewhat unusual for men over the entire history of art. But it's definitely a male there. And then we can now plot chromaticity plots of the costumes for men between 1800 and 1850, or women between 1900 and 1950, and so forth. And this contains a great deal of information. You can see when purples are introduced. You notice. I hope you can see my cursor here. No purples here, but lots of purples here when purple pigments are introduced, and a whole host of things like that. So this kind of tool helps the art historian in his or her scholarship, and they are embracing these kinds of tools pretty regularly now, finally. Now I want to go to a problem where computers can actually be not just reproduce what a human scholar can do, but actually surpass it. We know from the examples I showed in the second slide that computers can outperform humans on many, many tasks. I want to show how computers are better than highly trained art scholars at certain tasks, in particular, lighting analysis. So this is, of course, Vermeer's Girl with a Pearl Earring in the Mauritshuis in The Hague. Vermeer was Dutch Golden Age master, was widely recognized for his mastery in rendering the effects of light. But if you ask the simplest technical question about the illumination in this painting, it would be, what's the direction of illumination? And if two art scholars disagreed, how would you adjudicate? Are they both valid, equally valid interpretations? No. I'm going to show you 6 techniques from computer vision that answer this question absolutely crisply and clearly. And then I'll tell you how it changes our understanding of this painting and can be used elsewhere in the study of art. The methods fall into 2 categories. In model independent methods, we don't need to know or make any assumptions about the 3-dimensional form in the tableau. We'll look at a cast shadow, the shadow cast by the tip of her nose, and then the so-called occluding contour algorithm, which looks at the lighting along the outer boundary or occluding contour of her face. Then I'll turn to the model dependent methods. This is where we do need to make some assumptions about the 3-dimensional form in the tableau, like the 3-dimensional pearl, the eye, the full face, and then a full 3D computer graphics model. All right, the first is cast shadow analysis. Very simple. You don't even need a computer. You take a point on an occluder, like the tip of her nose, its corresponding cast shadow point, draw a straight line between those two with error bars, and you find that the direction to the illumination is 150 plus or minus 2 degrees, where throughout I'm going to measure angles with respect to the horizontal, like that. The occluding contour algorithm, or the theory of it, comes from a branch of computer vision called shape from shading. If I had a 3D model of her face, then shape from shading algorithms can infer what direction of illumination on that 3D model would give us the pattern of lightness that we find in the actual painting. And we would describe the 3D form, and here's the fundamental equations. It's basically Lambert's cosine law, that the brightness at a given place is due to the reflectivity, or albedo R is the face black or white or gray. And then the dot product between the normal vector, the perpendicular line at a given point, dotted into the unknown direction to the illumination, and there might be some overall ambient. The problem with this method is that we don't know, if we don't have a model, we don't know what the normal is at each point. Is it in this direction? Is it in this direction? Well, 2 computer vision experts, Nilius and Eklund from Sweden actually, came up with a very clever approach to this. They said, all right, we don't know what the normal is in the middle of the face, but along the outer boundary or occluding contour, we do. Think about it. The normal must be perpendicular to that contour and in the plane of the painting. It's not pointing towards us or away from us. And so we can know it perfectly. We can just basically draw it, or the computer can compute it. And it's a 2-dimensional vector. It lies in the plane of the painting. And so that simplifies all the equations. And we now know the normal vector nx with components nx and ny for each point along the occluding contour. Well, then you can measure the lightness along the contour and solve some coupled linear equations to find the best direction of illumination that explains the pattern of lightness on the contour. Here's one way to look at it. We have a 3D object, and we have a patch here that happens to be somewhat gray. Its brightness is determined by 3 things: the overall intensity of the light, which we can set to 1, the albedo, the reflectivity of the object, is it black or white or gray, and then the dot product between the normal vector and the unknown direction of illumination. So we don't know the green direction, but we do know the normal. So if I just tell you one patch, I have one equation in 3 unknowns, and you can't solve it. But if I measure the brightness along the entire contour, then I have many such patches, and we can set up those sets of equations and infer, in a least square sense, the direction to the illumination. Now, I and my colleagues were the first to ever apply this to paintings, and like a good scholar, I tried to find in the literature, has anyone else tried this technique? And I searched and I searched and I couldn't find anything. But then I came across someone who had done it. Leonardo da Vinci, in about 1508, when he was in his notebooks deciding how bright should he paint the outer the occluding contour, he didn't use that term, the outer boundary of the face, he said, when the light strikes perpendicularly, paint it bright. When light strikes at a large angle like this, paint it dark. And his notes describe this very, very well. He was using this principle for painting it correctly or accurately or realistically or representationally. We're going the other way and measuring it and inferring the direction of illumination. By the way, this technique was developed for forensic photography. Many years ago, 20 or so, there was a photograph of Brad and Angelina that came out that sold for $500,000, $500,000. And not to be outdone, the Star tabloid magazine published this photo of Brad and Angelina. And my friend Hani Farid used the occluding contour algorithm and found that on Brad, the light was coming from this direction. On Angelina, it was coming from a different direction. This was photoshopped. It was tampered. And it was exactly this method that I just described that can expose the tampering. But what this also points out is how poor humans are at detecting inconsistencies in lighting. We're actually not very good. Even art connoisseurs are not that good at recognizing these inconsistencies, but the computer methods are. And so here's more of the mathematics. If I might measure the brightness at different normal vector angles like this, they should fit a cosine curve. You want to fit the cosine curve and find where the peak is, and that tells you where the direction of illumination is. That's all this linear algebra does. And so here are the results on Girl with a Pearl Earring, that the direction based on the of illumination based on the occluding contour algorithm is 149 plus or minus 4 degrees. Next, for the model dependent methods, I took a high-resolution photograph of the pearl in that painting, and I could extract the occluding contour, and then we make the very plausible assumption that the pearl is cylindrically symmetric. So I could make a full 3D computer graphics model of the pearl. You have to texture map, you have to apply the white to the surface, and a pearl has specular and diffuse reflections, and you have to adjust by eye the relative components of those. It's not really unimportant for this problem. You get something like this. But now in the computer graphics model, we can place the illuminant wherever we want until the rendered pearl matches, in a sum squared error sense, the pearl in the painting as closely as possible. And that's this. And now we know the angle to the illumination because we placed the illumination where we did. And it turns out for this painting, for this pearl, the direction is 155 plus or minus 4 degrees. Now for the analysis of the highlights in the eye. We model the eye as a sphere, and then there's a light source here. The light sends light to the light source, sends light to the eye, reflects off it, and comes to the eye of the observer, the painter. It all lies in a plane. And what that means is that if you draw a line from the center of the eyeball through the center of mass of the highlight, that points in. I hear a lot of clicking. Is that can that be muted? Thank you. The green line shows the straight line pointing to the direction of illumination, and it turns out to be 150 plus or minus 2 degrees. The most sophisticated technique we use goes back to that problem or that method of shape from shading. As I mentioned, if we have a 3D computer graphics model of the face, then shape from shading can say, for that model, what is the direction of illumination that leads to the pattern of lightness that we find in the painting? But the problem is we don't have a 3D model. So we did the next best thing. We used the Stanford man model, it's actually a male model, we adjusted its pose to match the face in the girl's face as closely as possible. And we temporarily assumed that was her face. And then we ran shape from shading, and we get an estimate to the direction of the illumination. That's our initial light source estimate. But it's not going to be very accurate because this model doesn't match, 3D model doesn't match her face very, very well. So once we had the initial light source estimate, we can use the algorithm in a different way. And we say, all right, hold the light source fixed and fix the model, adjust the size of the nose and the albedos and so forth in order to match the painting more accurately. Now we get a better model of her face. And now we can use this better model of her face and re-estimate the direction to the illumination. And we go back and forth. We only had to do it 2 times in order to get a stable model of her face and stable model to the direction to the illumination. Those of you who've taken machine learning will recognize this as the EM, or expectation maximization algorithm. And what we find is that the direction to the light is 160 plus or minus 5 degrees. The last method we used was to build a full 3D computer graphics model of her face. And we can now rotate it around. You probably didn't know she had another pearl. Now, of course, this is a formally ill-posed problem, going from a 2D image to a 3D model. So we have to make some assumptions. And the criterion, or the property of this, is that it's not biased. There might be uncertainties, but they're not biases that are going to make the light too high or too low. So we're going to quantify that uncertainty, but it's a perfectly valid and reasonable way to estimate the direction to the illumination. So now we're just moving the light source all around her face, and then we're going to stop it in the configuration that matches the painting and fly around Vermeer's studio and look at the subject from many different directions. And then we're going to stop the rotation in the configuration that matches the painting, and then do a so-called alpha blend, basically blur from the computer graphics model to the painting, and we'll see that it matches extremely accurately. And so now in this computer graphics model, we know where we put the light, so we know the direction to the illumination. So here are 3 stills from that movie with you, if you will, with the light a little too high, just right, and a little too low. And I won't go through the careful comparison of the shading and so forth with the painting to say why this is the actual best match. And thus the estimate is 160 plus or minus 5 degrees. Okay, well, here are our results. Here are the methods, and here are the angles, and the direction to the illumination turns out to be about 155 degrees. That's actually not very interesting and not very important. But what is interesting and what is extremely important is the very small standard deviation, the remarkable agreement in directions on the estimated by these disparate methods. 3.8 degrees is the standard deviation of the estimate, incredibly small. Here's one way to visualize it. The red line is pointing at 155 degrees, and the yellow curve is a so-called cardioid. It tells us the relative given all this evidence, the relative probability of finding the light in this direction, in this direction, in this direction, so forth. And the fact that the yellow line cardioid is so long and drawn out shows the remarkable agreement among these methods. Okay, so what? Why would an art historian be interested in this? Well, this painting is not a portrait. We don't know who this girl is. It's a so-called trony, or character study, in this case, to celebrate youth and beauty and so forth. And some art scholars genuinely debated whether there actually was a girl present in Vermeer's studio. Maybe he could have done this from his imagination. Well, the fact that he got this lighting so incredibly accurate and consistent is almost sure evidence that there was a girl present. Well, that's not a major discovery in art history, but this technique can also be used in multiple portraits in the Renaissance, where you might have four figures, and now you look at the lighting on each one individually and see whether they're consistent or inconsistent, like Brad and Angelina. And if the lighting is very inconsistent, it suggests that the portraits were done under different studio conditions, maybe different time of year, perhaps different artist, or as we say, different hand. So that's how we can use this computer vision technique to see things that even art connoisseurs can't do very well. Now I want to use, pardon me, this technique to address what I think was one of the earliest applications of computer vision in addressing problems in the history and interpretation of fine art. When you stand back and look at the grand sweep of the development of Western painting, you find something very interesting happened around the year 1430. Before that time, images were somewhat awkward and schematic, like this Giotto fresco portrait. I mean, look at that ear. It's very schematic and almost cartoon-like. Or this Austrian portrait of a king, or this lovely Masolino porcelain doll-like figure that's in Florence. I saw last trip. But after that time, we get paintings like this. Robert Campin's A Man of 1430. It looks so realistic, almost photographic. This portrait has a personality, an individuality, a psychological depth lacking in these earlier works. This guy looks like us. What happened? Well, in order to explain the emergence of this new art, or ars nova, as it was called, the celebrated contemporary painter David Hockney came up with a bold and very, very controversial theory. Hockney laid out his theory in a book called Secret Knowledge, and in a nutshell, his theory is this: that these later paintings looked optical, as he called them, because they are optical, that Renaissance painters secretly used optical devices during the execution of their works. And Hockney was partially motivated because he himself uses photographs when he makes his own paintings. And here's how Hockney hypothesized these artists worked. Here's his concave mirror projection method. Here's David Hockney in his studio in Santa Monica, California. Very important. A lot of light in my home state. Not today, it's raining, but most of the time. Here's the figure, the subject outside. And there's a window here. And the key element in all of this is this concave mirror, like a shaving or makeup mirror that anyone in physics can convince you can project an image just as does a lens. And here is the real inverted projected image that mirror produces. And Hockney believes that the artist would then trace that image, put it down, and then look at the artwork and fill in details and then apply paint. Okay, well, that's his theory. One of the paintings he adduces as evidence is Georges Delatour's Christ in the Carpenter's Studio in the Louvre. He writes, the source of light seems to be outside the picture, as it must be if you use optics. Joseph and the girl, it's not a girl, it's Christ, were probably painted separately, each lit by a shielded light source in place of the other figure. And so in his book, he shows two, I'll call them half paintings. He says, when Christ was painted, the light source was in place of St. Joseph. And when St. Joseph was painted, the light source was in place of Christ. So you have to look at this half painting and try to determine where the light source is. You're not very good at it. I'm not very good at it. Art scholars are not very good at it. And Hockney is not very good at it. I'm going to show you how computers answer this question absolutely clearly. The first method is cast shadow analysis. We take a point on the left thumb of St. Joseph and its corresponding cast shadow point, draw a straight line, and bingo, it goes right to the candle flame. The candle is behind Christ's hand. That white you see there is smoke. If you do a full set of these cast shadows, you find that the brightest, it's the most probable place is right here, that right at the light source, less likely here and less likely here. Yes, there is one cast shadow that is consistent with Christ, the light source being in place of Christ, but it has a very small moment or lever arm, if you will. And the vast majority agree here. So I hope you can see these gray contours. These are contours of equal likelihood, equal a posteriori probability density. It's most likely, given this evidence, most likely the light's here, less likely here, less likely here, less likely here, like the high pressure region on a weather map. And the way I calculated those is using a maximum likelihood estimation method, saying the probability density at a given point, given all these cast shadows, is basically the probabilities of each one multiplied together. So if one contour says, oh, it's most likely, one cast shadow says it's in this direction, would this fall off? The other says, no, it's in this direction, would this fall, and so forth. You just multiply them together to find, it's most likely here, less likely here, less likely here, less likely here. And that's what I showed on that previous slide. Now we can also use the occluding contour algorithm that I taught you. So, for instance, the contour along Christ's shin and many others. Here's a description of why we get a cosine. It's just due to geometry. I won't go through it. If light goes straight onto a source, onto a plane, it's going to be the brightest. If it comes from a given angle, you're going to have a cosine term, 1 over a cosine term, and all the way down like this. The data will fit a cosine curve. And here's some. I'll get to our painting in a moment, but here's some other paintings we've studied: Caravaggio's St. Francis in Ecstasy, Supper at Emmaus in the National Gallery in London, and many others. This one in LACMA, Los Angeles County Museum of Art. The contours give a light source position very close to the candle for here. I won't go through the technical assumptions. You have to assume that the surface is uniform albedo. It won't work on a zebra, and a few other conditions that are held here. Anyway, here are the results. Each one of these red arrows is put in by the computer. It measures, or it takes in the lightness along the little contour sections, uses the occluding contour algorithm, and then draws in the direction. And look how well they meet at the candle flame, not outside the picture frame, as Hockney says, and certainly not in place of St. Joseph and so forth. Here we can use the same kind of maximum likelihood estimation to say, given this evidence, it's most likely the light is here, less likely here, less likely here, and so forth all the way down. Clearly, it's at the position of the candle, and Hockney is wrong. One of the benefits of working in probability is that you can integrate different evidence. So here's the cast shadow evidence I showed you 10 slides ago. Here's the occluding contour evidence, and you just multiply them together to find, given all this evidence, the light source is most likely here, less likely here, less likely here. Not in place of Christ, and certainly not outside the frame of the painting, as Hockney incorrectly states. But there's more lighting information in this painting we have not yet explored. The pattern of light over the floor. Look at it's light in the middle and it's dark over to the side. So where would a light source be? Would it be way over on the left? No. Would it be way over on the right? No. It'd be somewhere in the middle. And I won't go through all the mathematics of it, but we can make a so-called forward model saying, if the light is in some position, how would the brightness on the floor appear, depending upon the height, the location, the tip angle of the floor. I won't go through it all. You have a 1 over r squared dependence, the Lambert's cosine law, the cosine of that angle, and it's and you search for those three parameters, basically the location and tip angle of the floor, to minimize the sum squared error between your model and what you actually measure. And you do gradient descent. And anyway, here are the results, that the light source would be here. Now, it's true, it's not exactly at the place of the candle, but it's not in place of Christ, and certainly not outside the frame. And we think, a grad student and I think we figured out why it's a little bit low. It's mainly because the range of lightnesses that you find in the real world might be a factor of 1,000,000 between the brightest bright and the darkest dark, whereas paint can only give us a factor of about 100. The whitest white paint you've got and the blackest black paint you've got, it's only about a factor of 100. And that shifts vertically, but not horizontally, the location of the illumination. So all of this evidence points against Hockney's theory. But there's even more lighting information we haven't used. Just as we built a 3D computer graphics model of the girl's head in The Girl with the Pearl Earring, we built a 3D computer graphics model of the tableau in this painting. And then we put the light source in place of St. Joseph and illuminated Christ. And then in place of the candle and illuminated Christ. And compared the images we got, the lighting over them, and said, which one matches the painting best? Problem is, we didn't know the depth into the tableau, so we tried 19 positions in place of St. Joseph, 19 in place of the candle, and chose the best from each and compared them. Before I show you the results, let me show you the computer graphics model. If you take computer art history, St. Joseph's the carpenter, we have the tools here. Christ is the light of the world, he has a candle. And I hope you can see that the cast shadow is changing down here as we adjust the position of the illumination, and we watch how the pattern moves over Christ's chest and so forth. Now we're going to rotate and look at the painting tableau from the back, stop it in the configuration that matches the actual painting, and then do, again, an alpha blend to see how well it matches. And here's the best image we could get with the light in place of St. Joseph. Look at Christ. Here's the best we could get with the light in place of the candle. And we have to say which one matches the actual painting as best. And there's no question, none whatsoever, that the light in place of the candle matches the painting best. Look at the pattern of light over Christ's chest. Look at the angle of the cast shadow of the shin. Not exactly the same, but much, much better than in Hockney's theory, and so forth all the way through. No question, light was in place of the candle, and Hockney is wrong. Oh, sorry, this got in. Let me skip ahead. I accidentally continue to share. Sorry, this one. Here we go. Now I want to turn to another painting. Continue to share. Here's another painting. Hockney adduces as evidence the extraordinary masterpiece, Jan van Eyck's Portrait of Arnolfini and his wife in the National Gallery, London. Hockney believes Van Eyck placed a convex mirror at the very center of this Arnolfini masterpiece. The very mirror which, turned around, he may well have used to construct the image. Here's a detail of that passage in the painting, the very famous convex mirror, probably the most famous mirror in all of art. You see the reflection, the back of Arnolfini, the back of his wife. You see the two witnesses to the wedding coming through the doorway. And of course, it's a convex mirror, as we can see with the distortion of the window, the distortion of the bed drapes, and so forth down here. But Hockney and his scientific colleague Charles Falco believe that Van Eyck took this mirror off the wall, turned it around to make a concave mirror, and used it to project an image for making the painting. Well, let's understand some of the physics that would have to hold and give evidence if that's the case. Let me remind you about focal length in cameras. Here's a photograph of me as a new graduate student, a new assistant professor at Swarthmore College many years ago, taken with a short focal length or wide-angle lens. Notice the size of me and the size of the pillars on Parish Hall back here. Then the photographer put on a longer focal length lens, so-called normal lens, 50 millimeters, twice the focal length, so that magnifies everything by a factor of 2. But he moved back from me twice as far so as to ensure that I'm the same size in these two photographs. But look at the pillars. The pillars appear larger. Then he put on a telephoto lens, 200 millimeters, a factor of 4. He moved back from me 4 times as far to ensure I'm still the same size in the 3 pictures. But now look at the pillars. Pillars appear larger still. All of these photographs are in perfect perspective. I mean, they're a photograph after all. But the relative sizes of the objects depend upon the center of projection, where the camera is situated. Well, you can work backwards. And if you know the sizes of the objects and have an image, you can work backwards and infer what focal length was used. I teach my undergraduate art history majors how to do it. It's really simple. Anyone can do it, I assure you. So we can do that for the Arnolfini portrait. First, let me show you some Vermeer paintings where the location of the center of projection, where the artist's eye would be with respect to the painting, leads to different perspectives. They're really all in the same proper perspective. This is called accelerated perspective. You move back further, you get normal perspective, and if you move back infinitely far, you get what's called orthographic perspective all the way back here. So if I give you this image, you can work backwards and find how far back where the eye of the artist was when he made the painting. And so to do that for the Arnolfini portrait, we have to make a 3D computer graphics model so that we're consistent with our assumptions of the sizes. Here's our computer graphics model, and here's the mathematics. I won't go through it. It just tells you for the relative sizes on the picture plane, you can find how far back the center of projection was based on the heights of the projected images. And so here is the 3D model from the side. Here is the painting where to scale, and I'm going to demonstrate this with a lens, even though Hockney believed it was a mirror. Turns out the mathematics is all the same in this case. You put a lens here, and this is the position where we get the image plane and the objects, such that the size of the projected image of the chandelier corresponds to the size of the real chandelier. Of course, it's not real, it's computer graphics. Size of Arnolfini corresponds to the size of Arnolfini, the image, and so forth, all the way through 13 pairs of objects back and forth to find where the lens would be and these distances, which anyone in high school optics can compute the focal length, because you have the object distance from an object to the lens, and the image distance from the image to the lens, and it's the lens equation, and turns out the focal length turns out to be about 61 plus or minus 8 centimeters. Well, Hockney says it was, and Falco say it was the mirror at the back. We can infer the focal length of the mirror on the back using some basic optics. If we have a section of a convex mirror, so that means it was cut from a sphere of unknown radius of curvature, that the curviness, whether it's a gently curved like a big radius of curvature, or sharply curved with a small radius of curvature. I won't go through all the mathematics, but it warps positions that you see in the mirror to where they would be in the real world. And we don't know that radius of curvature of the mirror. So we adjust that. We de-warp the image with candidate radii of curvature. One radius of curvature gives us this, a different gives us this, a different, and so forth. And we adjust them Here, you can do it on mirrors too. I won't go through that. When we adjust it properly, we de-warp the image like this, that the window is as rectilinear as possible, the perspective is as coherent as possible, and so forth. And now we can compute what the radius of curvature is. And once you have the radius of curvature, we know what the focal length is. And if Hockney and Falco are right, the focal length of this mirror should be pretty close to 61 plus or minus 8 centimeters. But when you do the math, it turns out to be 18 plus or minus 4 centimeters. Much, 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 much too short to be consistent with Hockney's claim. Hockney is wrong. Here's from my article in Scientific American as a way to visualize those different radii of curvature. So here's the 3D model. Here's the sphere, and hence the radius of curvature is the radius of that. For the mirror at the back, here it is for the putative projection mirror. They differ significantly. Could not have been done. Hockney is wrong. Well, could another mirror have been used? No. Why? Because the perspective is all inconsistent. Now, whenever you talk with an art historian, you have to say, that doesn't mean it's a bad painting. This is before the rules of geometric perspective have gotten up to Bruges, where you get a consistent vanishing point. But here you take perspective lines, they meet here, but this one doesn't meet it. These two lines are parallel, they never meet, and so forth. So it couldn't have been done with a single projection, and even not with multiple patchwork projections, because these lines are straight over long distances and so forth. But what about that chandelier? Hockney believes that chandelier is in perfect perspective. And I thought I'd check. So here's a overhead view, or so-called plan, of the 6-arm chandelier. I've numbered the arms 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You take corresponding points on 2 arms, like those decorative crockets, the little structures that hang below. Those define a line in Arnolfini's room. That line is parallel to the floor. Other crockets define another line, and those 2 lines, white lines, are parallel in Arnolfini's room. They're at different elevations, but they're both perpendicular to the bisecting plane here. And likewise for these 2 points. So here's the green is what I've just shown you. All those lines are parallel in Arnolfini's room. The lines defined by the other 2 are also parallel. They're also parallel here. And if you really think about it, lines defined on the other 2 arms of the chandelier are also parallel. So here is a symmetric computer graphics model of the chandelier. And if it's in perspective, of course it is, we made it so in the computer graphics model, then the projections of these lines should meet at a vanishing point, maybe somewhere down here. We take a line from here through this, extend it here through here. I think it's easier to look at than to describe. And indeed, all these lines meet at a great vanishing point here. Perfect perspective. Here's the Arnolfini chandelier. Hockney said it's in perfect perspective. He told 8 million people on the American television show CBS 60 Minutes that they were in perfect perspective. So if he's right, if we draw these lines just as we did on this, they better meet at a vanishing point down here. But when you do it, here's what you get. Kaboom, a complete mess, not close to being in proper perspective, not even close. And what this shows is that people, including famous artists, are really bad at telling whether something's in perspective. Absolutely, positively, not even close. Here's another way to look at it. Here's the chandelier. It looks in proper perspective, but it isn't. Here's one of those lines extended. Here's another one of those lines extended. Here's another one, 15, no match whatsoever. How far off? When we published this, Hockney and Falco said, well, maybe the chandelier was really goofy, really inconsistently made. How bad an artisan would have to be consistent with the image information and Hockney's idea? Well, You choose a vanishing point down here. It doesn't matter really much where it is. Take a line here. Here's the projection. It should go through here. It doesn't. This is how far off it is. A whopping 8 to 10 centimeters in Arnolfini's room. I and my colleague Antonio Cremonese did a careful study of surviving so-called denandri, the surviving metalwork from the Renaissance, and found that they are symmetric to 1 millimeter. And experts in denandri say such an arm would have been made from the same mold. You would have made 6 identical arms. And so this kind of variation would never have occurred. Hockney is simply wrong. Here's some of the most sophisticated math that went into our analyses. This comes from Antonio Cremonese's ACM award-winning PhD dissertation at Cambridge or Oxford, I think it was. If you have arm in one plane and its corresponding points on another plane rotated around, if it's perfectly in perspective and everything's done completely accurately, there's a very simple projection matrix that describes the positions here, given here. And if I find you these points, I can compute this projection matrix using a more Penrose pseudo-inverse. The details aren't important, but basically it's easy if it's perfect, but it's much harder if there's some error that that no single projection goes from each point to its corresponding point. So you have to find the best projection minimizes the squared differences between the locations of these points and their projections. And that's what Antonio solved. You minimize these sums of squares, and you do this, and you minimize a Lagrange. Anyway, and when you do that, to find the best rotation, you find, again, a whopping 8 to 10 centimeter, not millimeter, centimeter variation between the shapes. Absolutely positively inconsistent with Hockney's theory. There is one portion of the Arnolfini chandelier that is in reasonable perspective. Those are the Bobesch or candle holders here. I took a hexagon, perfect hexagon, and used the homography, the transformation, and found that it's pretty good. It matches those points really well. The rest is a mess. We've already seen this, but this is pretty good. Well, how impressive is that? Well, as part of my research, Nicholas Williams, a realist, an award-winning realist painter in the south of England, painted 2 chandeliers entirely by eye for me. No projections, no ruler, nothing, just by eye. One had 5 arms, and I did a pentagon, and it matches the positions even better than Van Eyck, slightly better than Van Eyck. So it shows that you don't need projections in order to do this well. And then he painted this lovely, complicated chandelier 2 for me. And I did my computer analysis on it, and I found all the arms were really great, except one. One is off, statistically significantly off. You can't see it. I didn't see it until I did the computer analysis. But I emailed him and said, what's going on? What happened? He said, oh, yeah, I accidentally dropped the chandelier, and one of the arms bent off. And I said, 1.5 centimeters, 1.3, close enough. Let me show you how excellent the perspective is on this, done entirely without optics. Here is one of those arms in the chandelier, arm 1. Here's arm 2. And we do the transformation of arm 1 to be as similar to arm 2 as possible, and that's the transform of arm 1. Don't worry about the pan. That comes out of the plane. That is not going to match. We're mapping a plane to a plane. And so now when we overlap this with this, they overlap superbly to about 1 millimeter or 2. No question you can use, you don't need optics in order to paint in great perspective, and Hockney is wrong. Now I want to turn to some other computer analyses of paintings that I and my students have done. Here's Van Gogh's self-portrait in a gray felt hat. Van Gogh, of course, used so-called open brushwork. He often put down a layer of brushstrokes. and then another layer of brushstrokes, another on top, and you can see the layers. So over here, you can see, for instance, the red brushstrokes, the green brush, the white, and so forth. Wouldn't it be great to digitally remove the layers of brushstrokes one at a time so we can see how the painting, as we say, developed? Well, I won't go through the algorithm. Basically, we use k-means clustering to find out how many colors there are, then use form analysis to find which brushstroke is on the top layer, digitally remove it, and do in-painting fill in the rest. And that tells us what the painting looked like without that last layer. Then we do it again. Then we do it again. Then we do it again until we get down to something like this. And now we can play it as a movie going backwards, or really forward in time. This was the first appearance. First, and then, I'm sorry, I don't have the things here, but you see the layers come up again and again. Here's perhaps a better example. This is Jackson Pollock's Lucifer, one of my favorite paintings of his. I've seen, I think, all of them in public view, even down in Australia and so forth. But this one happens to be in Stanford. And if you take a detail of it, here it is on the left, you use that algorithm and the computer decides, the purple is on the top layer, mainly because no other paints occlude it or break it over. And so the computer takes away the purple and says, this is what the painting looked like before Pollock poured the purple on it. And now we do it again. And the next one was blue and got rid of the blue and then got rid of the red. And so time goes from right to left. This is how the painting looked. Pollock then poured red paint on, then poured blue paint on, then played purple paint on. And so we see this sort of like a movie going forward in time. And this gives us a new understanding of how the artwork was created. Now, here's a technique I developed with some students at the Technical University of Vienna. Segmenting art images. We want to know, where a figure is so that we can count them. We can find out what percentage of the area is covered by them. We can look for changes over time and so forth. So here are 5 paintings from Picasso to Alice Neel to Modigliani, Matisse, and Alex Katz. And if you run a deep neural network that's trained on photographs, we get these kinds of segmentations. Not so bad here, but you can see how off it is here. The errors here really poor on the Matisse and really bad on the Alex Katz. What do? We want better recognition. Well, it turns out there just aren't enough paintings. We would say, we'd like to train with paintings, but there are just not that many paintings compared to the number of photographs. So we did the following. We made surrogate paintings by using deep neural networks for style transfer. So here's a portrait photograph of me years ago, and here's a Matisse painting. And I won't go through the math or the algorithms, but you can put those together to say, what would David look like if Matisse had painted him? Now, it's not a great painting, but it does have the style, somewhat of the style. And now we can make 1 million of these paintings very easily. So we could have Oprah Winfrey in the style of Monet, or a helicopter in the style of Modigliani, or whatever. And we can get a large number and use those to train the segmentation network. And now you take this new network and segment the images, and it's much better, almost perfect. Look at this. The segmentation doesn't make the error over here. The Alice Neel is nearly perfect, and so forth. So that's how we handle that problem, in this case, of small data sets. We create surrogate paintings that have the style of artworks, but have the image designs of photographs. And the last major topic I want to talk about this evening for you, morning for me, is inferring meaning, semantics, and in paintings. And one of the simplest or most direct and most ubiquitous problems, especially in the Renaissance, is identifying we call them actors, in a religious artwork. who's Christ, who's Mary, who's St. John the Baptist, who's Mary Magdalene, and so forth. And we use what are called attributes. This is very different from computer vision and pattern recognition attributes. An attribute is an object or symbol that a figure carries that identifies him or her to the usually illiterate parishioners who are looking at the artworks. So, for instance, St. Peter's attribute is the key. He has the kingdom of heaven. So whenever you see a saint or old elderly figure holding a key, you know it's St. Peter. Well, can we get a computer to recognize this attribute? Well, here are some of the attributes that we train to recognize. To recognize a cross, the lamb, a boat, an axe, a wheel, a dragon for St. George and the Dragon, John the Baptist has a cross, and so forth. And so here are training data here just for the keys. You can see all these keys, many different forms, large, small, different orientations, in different colors, and held and not held, and so forth. And so here are the results. So we can recognize a dove. We can recognize the lion, the crucifixion cross. Look at the difference in the types of crucifixion cross. This thin, small one held by hand in this Del Sarto painting, Giacinto's very large one, and so forth. And now we use a different semantic segmentation algorithm like we showed earlier for the costume analysis to segment the figures. And now we put those together in the following way. So here's Verrocchio's Baptism of Christ in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, where I just was in November. And here's the segmentation. So we know where the figures are. And here are the attributes, the dove and the crucifixion cross. And we say which figure is closest to which attribute and use the lookup table to say, aha, that's Christ, that's St. John the Baptist. Now, when I show this to art scholars, traditional art scholars, they say, so what? I knew that. What's the big deal? And I have to tell them, well, first of all, it's harder than you think, but we can now automate this and do thousands of paintings very, very quickly. And this is just a start. It's like the first computer chess systems were very poor, and they'll get better and better as we go on. And here's one of the more sophisticated paintings we addressed, Jan van Steenwijk's Still Life in the National Gallery, London. This painting from the Dutch Golden Age is screaming with meaning. It's a so-called vanitas painting, where each one of these objects has a symbol, symbolizes something, all going together to give the meaning for this painting, which everybody at the time would have known, which is lead a humble, sober life, because when you die, you're going to live eternity in heaven. How does it say that? Well, clearly the skull, well placed right at the center, symbolizes mortality. There's a watch here. Time is ticking. Your time is going away. This oil lamp here has a flame that just went out. You can see that the smoke is here, but not the flame. You could die at any moment. The worldly knowledge of books and so forth, the pleasures of wine and so forth, music and so forth are all there. There's heavenly light coming down on you. Moreover, except for the scarf, everything's in muted colors. Lead a humble, sober life. Don't be showy. Moreover, this painting is, I'll call it life size. If it were a miniature or a mural, large mural, it would not have the same kind of effect and message and meaning and moral as it does when it's life size hanging on your wall, where this skull looks like a skull of normal size. Well, how can we get a computer to recognize this? Well, we took 36 textual documents describing vanitas paintings, and my colleagues in London did the computer linguistic analysis to find so-called knowledge graph, where between the feature book, it would learn human knowledge, or smoke represents life's brevity, or an oil lamp is life's brevity, or a crab represents life, and bread represents Christianity, and so forth. So this is all done using AI. We didn't do it by hand. And now we can do the computer vision to recognize these objects, recognize a crown, recognize a book, so that we can get simple starts at meanings of this painting. We haven't done it, but we could make an interface so that you click on an object, a portion of the painting, and it'll say, this is a skull, and in this painting, it means mortality, and so forth. So this is a start towards meaning. And I want to put all of this in context. Here's my hero, Giovanni Morelli, who was a medical doctor who late in life turned his expertise to art history. And he had studied for medicine, the color of your fingers and skin, and the shape of your earlobes, and whether you're having arthritis and so forth. And he said, I can use this to analyze paintings. And he found that different artists depicted ears in different ways, and fingers and other things like that, as we see over here. And so he was able to use this technique to authenticate paintings. Now, authenticating a painting or reattributing a painting, say, it's not by this artist, it's by this other artist, is a big deal. And some art scholars will do 6 or maybe 10 in their lifetime. Giovanni Morelli did more than 100 using this techniques. So this was sort of the birth of scientific connoisseurship, which I think if he were alive today, he would certainly be using computers. And that's why I've called this field computer-assisted connoisseurship. He also wrote, writings on art which do not raise a storm of opposition can have little real merit. So all of this is in my book. I hope some of you will buy it and read it. But also, what was to be the last chapter of that book is now the separate new book forthcoming on art authentication. And I just want to give the high-level overview of my view, which is that using computers to integrate all information, human subjective responses, material studies, image analysis, brushstroke, putting it all probabilistically to render a probabilistic authentication decision is how the field should go. And that our attribution decision should be probabilistic. There's a 40% chance this is by Monet, a 60% chance, and it will change over time, rather than saying something's 100% Vermeer or 0% Vermeer, as is the style now. Anyway, that's what I'm working on. And I hope this intrigues you to study more about this fascinating field and help collaborate. Thank you very much.
Cool. Thank you very much. This applause doesn't transport in Zoom because it cuts it out, actually.
It's all right. It's all right.
So, yeah, this was amazing. Let me just say, so we take questions from the audience, if there are.
Sure.
Just raise your hand in Zoom if you've never been here.
I also see chat. Oh, clap in chat. Okay. Yeah. You can ask questions in chat as well.
So let me just start with a question with the very end. I think this is very, very interesting. So we can actually sort of go back to 2 Open Lab seminars. There was actually the most popular one on the YouTube stream is by James Evans, who is a computational social scientist at the University of Chicago, where he has this approach of embed everything. So the idea is to sort of like take all the information you can get and actually sort of like, make one giant concatenated vector space out of it, in a sense. And then the other extreme is sort of like what comes to mind, integrate all the data, is that we're now living in a world where we have sort of 30 years of data integration companies, right? From hedge funds like Renaissance Technologies to Palantir, whatever, they do exactly that. And one of the interesting things that you said, which is sort of countering a little bit that approach of like there's one real world where you can integrate everything, is that many different people have many different perspectives on the world, and different art historians looking at the same chandelier can have different ideas, and even the chandelier, as we have seen, can have many, many different vanishing lines, and because we cannot concentrate on all of them at the same time, it looks realistic to us. So the question is, can there be something like one data integration, or is there always some incoherence in this whole thing, basically?
It's an interesting question. I think practically we should be limiting our domain to art. It's significantly different from photographs, that trying to make one full automated, general intelligence and then applying it to art would be far less successful and accurate as getting an art database that is packed with all the information about pigments over history and time and so forth. Of course, world knowledge will come in. Who was Napoleon? That's going to come in when you're looking at Jacques-Louis David's paintings, for instance. So, this reminds me of the big debate at the very beginning of art history, of AI, where my former professor Marvin Minsky said, oh, let's build general intelligence and then just apply it to vision and then just apply it to sound. That was a big, big mistake. And we had separate methods for speech recognition and computer vision and motion planning and so forth, and then put them together. And I think the same thing is true now, that we're not going to get I don't want to take, Chat GPT 12 and have it apply to art if it hasn't been sort of primed with material studies, what kind of pigments were available and so forth. So I think practically we should sort of limit and not make the vector space involve general intelligence. That's my view.
So you're saying we're going back to, or we're probably still living in a world where behind the scenes, no matter how general it is sold to us, there is expert systems, proper.
Rather than calling it expert system, I would just say domain specific. That trying to learn too much. It's, as read it in my pattern recognition book, it's really the bias variance dilemma. How much data you have for a given task at hand. And I'm perfectly happy to limit my career to problems like art authentication, things like that, not general intelligence. I think that's kind of too much. But we'll see.
Cool. Sander has a question.
Go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you for the talk. It's very refreshing to see. It's easy to follow, interesting mathematically. I have a lot of things now on my reading list, but
good. Well, start with my book.
Oh, good idea. I have a very simple question, probably about the surrogate data when you mentioned.
Yes,
that's the one part. What's the situation right now with these kind of AI research, especially given like what I understand, this is not my field, is that generally, if you feed AI's own output, it eventually collapses. But how does this creating surrogate paintings in a certain style and then teaching AI on it, how does that work? Is there not a problem with this, input output being the same?
It's a very good question, but here's the answer. It's that we're not learning the full artwork. We're the design. Think of it as form and content, or style. Content and style. We're giving it the content. It's the picture of David Stork. It's a picture of Oprah Winfrey. We're not going to change that. We're not going to feed that back and say, adjust that and adjust that. No, it's going to have this. And so we only loop once. We just, it was like my slide showed. We just take the style, we just take the figure and put them together. We don't feed it back, which is where you get those big problems, the hallucinations, as they're called. Is that clear?
Okay. Yeah, that's clear. Thank you.
Other questions?
Yeah. Okay. So if no one's raising their hand, let me ask.
Well, I'm interested in what people think about using probability for art authentication as the output, because half of the traditional art community says, obviously, this is of course what we should do. And the others say, no, that you can't represent my subjective feeling by a number, and either it was by Vermeer or not. So what does it mean when you're saying 70%? And I'm happy to answer that. And anyone in statistics and probability understands what the answers will be. But what I want is people to push back on me, give me the hardest questions, try to dissuade me so that when I write my book, I've answered your questions. I don't want to publish a book and then someone say, but you didn't think about this.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
How is that would relate to the pricing of the things?
This is exactly thank you. I have a whole section on this. The biggest pushback I get from the art world is from the commercial art community. They say, no one wants to pay $50 million, put a painting on the wall, tell all their friends, hey, there's a 70% chance this is by Monet. Got it. What I think will happen is, imagine the following. Imagine my program works well. By program, I don't mean the computer program, I mean the viewpoint, and that I can give you 10 paintings, each of which has a 10% chance of being a Rembrandt, and you can buy each for $5,000. Would you do that? Yes, I would instantly. And part of the probabilistic output is saying the reason this has such a low probability is because of provenance. And you say, and now I'm going to start working on provenance. So I think it's going to become more like investing in stocks that go up and down and up and down, rather than 1 0 1 0s. But yes, but I also think it will bring more artworks to the market that right now aren't. There are certain paintings that scholars give a 50%, let's just say a 50%, or half say it's genuine, half say it's not. And no one wants to sell those. In my world, it would be sold. It would be sold cheaper, and it would set the market would be, the value would be set by the marketplace. But there are many paintings that right now no one's going to send to Christie's or Sotheby's or Bonhams or anything, or any of the auction houses, but they will if they follow my approach. That's my view. I haven't done it yet.
Thanks a lot. I think that's also resurfaced the question is like, many people, including me, don't really understand the extent to which an artwork can be so close to the original one.
I'm not. You mean?
I don't really have the understanding.
How can a fake be so good that it fools scholars?
Well, yeah, exactly. Because it can be very close, right?
That's the first chapter of my book, which is just a litany of the art scholars being wrong. I'm naming names. There are so many books out there about, Han van Meegeren, all the famous Wolfgang Beltracci and so forth, that really are centered on the forger, and say, look how good he was, and so on. Mine is entirely different. It's look at the evaluators. Here's the art scholar. Often those books don't mention who it was who screwed up. I'm naming names throughout all history. This guy got it wrong. One of the most famous connoisseurs of all time was at Harvard, who bought the paintings, Bernard Berenson, who bought the paintings for Frick and Isabella Stewart Gardner. And he was considered the greatest connoisseur of his time. Subsequent scholarship has shown that he was wrong 20% of the time. He's the best. And he's wrong 20% of the time. What about the others who aren't as good? So I'm naming names, and the whole point though is, in my subsequent chapters, here's how we solve the problem. So many people say, oh, look how bad it is. They don't say how to solve the problem, and that's what I'm working on. Anyway,
Great,
next
thanks.
question.
Cool. Sander had another one, right?
Sure, whatever.
I did for a moment. I guess I'll just fill there unless there's anything else. It's not. I'm not sure if it's exactly the pushback you're looking for, but
Well, no,
with
or
AI in
support,
general,
whatever, insight.
yeah. So with AI in general, right now we see this like there's multiple cultural clashes over
Yeah.
multiple fields of development. And with AI, you can hear some people say, "Well, we can do this better, and we can do that more accurately." Then there is always so there's two things that I'm wondering. Have you thought about, and how would you even approach thinking about it to sort of predict some details? So one of the things is AI used in medical diagnosis. That there's quite a hefty amount of research finding out that it's not that AI learned to predict some pathogen, but it just learned that, well, in the documents when the person is from this region and born at that time, that more relates to like a lead poisoning or something in that. So that the way we decide, the way the model learns something is actually something that is a flaw and or not incorrect in that sense, but in a way that can be exploited later. And the second one is the second point is like how would you even approach considering, let's say that your tool and approach works well, what would be the first way somebody would use it in a
Sure.
malicious way?
Okay. Well, let me do the first one.
Yes.
I've written 10 pages on medical analysis as sort of a template for how to move forward. In medical analysis, you have some objective measures, things like heart rate, a pulse, pH, blood type, all these kinds of things that are rigid and measured. Then there are subjective things. Oh, he looks a little down today. He's walking with a slight limp. He feels the pain is somewhat bad, but not. And you put all that together to make a diagnosis. And these AI systems are beating trained, board-certified diagnosticians, mainly because they get larger data sets and they know more outcomes than any person can ever experience. And so, yes, they sometimes learn aspects, features that were not obvious ahead of time, that the radiologist is really looking for the brightness of some tumor, whereas the real data is knowing this woman is 64 years old and comes from Brussels or whatever it might be. But that's information that if it's predictive, we want to know and we want to use it. And so part of what my system, I'll call it, will learn is the relative importance of provenance. Maybe provenance really isn't that important overall, and it's only material studies, and all these things will come together. Or provenance is really important in mid-century American art, but it's not that important in Renaissance painting or whatever it might be. So all of these things will be learned and keep getting better. And that's one of the most important lessons, that when an expert gets good, then they die. And they pass on their information through a book or something, which is really incomplete and ineffectual. Whereas such an AI system will keep getting better every year, as all its creators die or move into different fields or whatever. Preserve the information that gets gleaned over decades, centuries even.
I have a sort of like maybe provocative kind of question in a sense that so I'm a trained art historian, meaning I'm a trained neural network, and for 1.5 years of my PhD, I didn't read anything. I just looked at drawings. And I learned at the same time that, your best friend is geometric congruence, right? So if you one of my first jobs as a student was like take the fragments in the Glyptothek in Munich of stuff that has been taken off marble sculptures and try to fit them where they belonged. And often we had 3 generations of noses and ears and whatever. And obviously the geometric congruence allows you to fit it back. But then there's an interesting thing, which is that some sculptors and who did the completions were really good at it. So the lower arm of the Apollo of Tenea, which is an archaic sculpture, was completed in the 19th century. And even if you can touch it, it's just so, the completion is so good that you could fool, if probably the marble is not from the same island or whatever, but like you could fool any archaeologist. Well, so there's this uncanny thing that if you solve the geometric congruence problem, so you get a fit, like even if this chandelier was really within proper perspective, is that sort of like proof for something, or is it sort of like, is it something like that 19th century completion person? And then on the other hand, there is this thing where these things are actually super helpful, like with the radiology example. Like if you see the picture of a Greek vase with a sort of like muted blue background, the vase is in the Boston Museum of the Fine Arts because for 50 years they took pictures on a table with a blue piece of cloth below it. And you just recognize that. And then on the other hand, this sort of like ancillary metadata type information may actually sort of reveal something which is kind of, is sort of much closer to your point with the probability, even though you have no information about the artworks themselves. So let me give you an example. We found that in the first 20 years of the 19th century, in the art market in France, Great Britain, the Netherlands, and Belgium, the amount of particular paintings by the top 20 painters sold back then sort of has a trajectory of being sort of properly attributed. Like, the most popular painter was David Teniers, which is not the most popular right now, because he has small paintings which can be sold often, and obviously, they were floating around. But you could see over 20 years, about 61%, so we go from 10% to 61%, becomes derivative. So school of Teniers, looks like Teniers, probably student of Teniers and stuff like that. And while there is no real number to that, there is very much to your point, like people basically work with these kind of probabilities, they have these sort of heuristic categories which place the object more or less close to what it is. But then if you look at the frequencies of these things and the attributions, you actually realize these artist names are not really attributions. Like if they say Rubens, they don't say Rubens, they say, a lot of like pretty well-fed human bodies. While if they say point,
Rubenesque.
They mean clouds. Or if they, when they say Teniers, then it's a bunch of drunk people in a pub. And so that kind of stuff where you almost get these kind of supermarket categories. That I think is something which closes makes the art, the system of Western art sort of a system which is overclassified in a sense. You see what I mean? So there's a sort of like, we only have, I don't know, maybe 1 million artworks, maybe even less, maybe 500,000.
I use 5 million in my talks, but not that many. I agree.
You know what I mean, right? So this is actually not. This is the amount of pictures that's uploaded on a bad day in 2026 into Facebook, and Facebook is not popular anymore in an hour. We're all back,
right? I know that was my second point on that first slide. Small data sets, and that's why we need expertise. And whenever you have a small data set, it's a bias variance trade-off. You have to impose some sort of constraints or knowledge and so forth.
And so what's the question where I want to get out of is, like you said, like we need this kind of integration. But the question is, like, once we assume the data is integrated, but we have the data sort of not only embedded in a model, but like it's explicitly there. So we will have an explicit knowledge graph. We have the explicit measurement information that you take, for example, in terms of geometry. Then we can actually mutually put these things into question. You can question your knowledge graph in how much, because there were a lot of things where, is a lobster a symbol of life, or is it just a tasty piece of food? Right? So that is the question.
Yeah, well, I mean, to take the lobster as an easy example, I mean, at that period, Dutch Golden Age Vanitas paintings, it definitely meant life, and everybody knew it, and the writers of the time knew it. These paintings were sometimes called visual sermons, to convey a moral and meaning. But a lobster, in pop art wouldn't mean that at all. So all of these things are context dependent, and that's part of the stuff that you would learn.
But if
I'm not sure I answered your question, but
yeah, but if I was a snarky, like if you want to make
please be snarky.
If you want to make a juicy kind of like art history article that is sort of entertaining in a Burlington magazine, you would find out that, I don't know, some kind of owner of these paintings may have conveyed to the priest that they're sort of like have these sermons on the wall, while in reality they're actually only thinking about the fact that lobster with lemon is just a really good dish.
Well, yes, they're polysemous. There are going to be many meanings and different motivations. I mean, what would an art scholar do? The art scholar would, a smart art scholar would say, "Oh, look, this collector, this patron, has other paintings that showed lots of food that had nothing to do with, moralism and things like this." And so that would be part of the context. I mean, basically, anything an art historian can do someday, it's a long way away, AI will be able to do. And in the meantime, we just put in more information, use the constraints, use the criteria and the knowledge that art scholars bring to the table, and try and build a system, just as we did with medicine. So that other question, I think medicine is exactly a very good sort of template, roadmap, if you will.
Okay, now I got a question which is sort of like extending the whole topic. So you focus on art,
Yeah.
but your past, and obviously the way you focus on the art is related to that, but there's a really interesting thing. Like you wrote a book about the physics of sound, you wrote about rainbows, you did holograms to do automatic pattern recognition. You deal obviously with, not only the geometry, but matrix algebra, when you do sort of larger scale kind of comparisons and stuff like that. So before we started the session, we had a slight little chat, and it was like, are you a fan of Hermann von Helmholtz? Which obviously you said yes.
Yes.
So would you think we're closer to a sort of shared foundation where we'd say, oh, we really, if we would do liberal arts in 2026, where people are not forgetting that sound exists, and they're not forgetting that, the geometry of central perspective is actually sort of the same geometry as if you calculate the eigenvectors of a larger matrix and stuff like that. So you're smiling because you know what I'm talking about, but you also know that this is completely brushing against the grain of what somebody in the humanities department would say we should teach to people in the first 2 years.
No, absolutely.
But my question is, shouldn't we do it?
Here's my view. I think not only in the past few decades or from Helmholtz and so forth, but especially in the era of AI, the opportunities and the interesting problems are at the intersections of different disciplines. That it's art history and computer science, or stuff I worked on, computer science and optics, and all these different joint fields. So what I do tell my students, my recommendation in the coming era of AI is to be broader than you would normally. That if you get really, really narrow, there are going to be very few of you, and you could be the second best person, and you're not going to get the job. But instead, finding connections between different disciplines. I mean, basically, that your whole Kudon is somewhat like that. Statistics and art history or music history and things like that, culture. And I think there's going to be more of that going forward. That we have disciplines in the university, but the real action is going to be at the intersections, at the boundaries of disciplines.
So somebody who has been in academia and in the industry, would you say this is easier in industry because in like, you know, cultural data analytics in some sense mixes different methods in different subject domains from different schools and disciplines. And I'm very much with you what you're saying in terms of science, but the longer I do this, I have the feeling that academia is sort of like really bristling against this. It's trying hard not to accept it, basically.
I agree 100%, especially now that we're being recorded, I won't name names, but let's just say art history departments have shunned topics that were central a few decades ago, like authentication. I wouldn't trust an academic art historian, hardly any academic art historians, to do a real authentication. How do you put together material studies and condition studies and provenance and connoisseurship and so forth? We're just not training them for that. I mean, there's a wonderful article, I just cited it in my book. I don't have the title offhand, but it's basically, you know, we're losing this expertise, and we really are. I mean, yes, it's crucial in the auction houses and some of the commercial galleries, but just look at the titles of the dissertations that are coming out of most universities, with a few notable exceptions. I think New York University, Institute for the Humanities, Harvard Courtauld Institute, you know, there are a couple that really care about the stuff that has answers. I mean, to me, it got summarized. I gave a talk at a major American museum, and the director came up to me afterwards and said, "Oh, this is really fascinating, but the art world will never buy it because you're in the job of giving answers. We're in the job of giving interpretations." And there's a fundamental intellectual disconnect there. And partly in my book, I wish I had more time, I want to say, if you don't get the the facts correct, your interpretations get untethered. So I'm trying to collect, and if anyone has examples, please email them along, of someone who did a big interpretation of this painting. Oh, this Rembrandt is saying this, and this. It turns out not to be a Rembrandt. So that all of the and it happens all the time. Give me examples to frankly shame them, that you should care about what I care about, at least before you do your interpretations. Anyway, that's my view.
There's a really cool example. Like, obviously, the discussion and what you're just opening, this is also happening since as long as art exists. There's this successor of Michelangelo as the architect of New St. Peter's, which is Piero Ligorio, which nobody knows today. He wrote a book called Le Paradosse, which means like the paradoxes. And it's basically a whole book where he shames all the other scholars about antiquity. And it's like, this person he's like wrong about that, he's wrong about that, he's wrong about that. And, you know, brilliant book. But obviously he didn't make any friends. And in the end, he was actually, every architect of St. Peter's tore down a part of whatever the predecessor was building. And Michelangelo did that too, actually. But Piero Ligorio dared to tear down a part that Michelangelo built, so they put him into jail, and they finished it in the manner of Michelangelo. So one of the interesting things is there seems to be sort of a power game going on, like who sits in the position and who is in the social position. And then the key question is, in how much is sort of like the actual sort of content and the evidence sort of like something that actually can sort of really convince a broader sort of like stratum of the scholars, right? For example, if you look at Caravaggio, he has 14 winged figures which are constructed in a completely different way. Like, there's no two that are the same, which sort of seems to be the point. So you cannot use it in a machine learning sense, for example, to say, yeah, that's a Caravaggio based on that. And so the question is what to leave out, what to bring in, and then what are the pet peeves of like sort of like the social crowd. That, I think, is sort of something which is something which will be one of the core issues if this sort of automated algorithmic computational generative sort of like connoisseurship can survive because people may just walk away from it, right?
Yeah, well, that's why the title of my book, subtitle is Computer Assisted Connoisseurship. So it's a tool.
Yes.
And I think like the pose analysis, nobody pushes back on that and says that's a mistake and you're stepping on, you're ruining art history because of that. Nobody. So I think we'll edge in bit by bit, but I do think once the public understands how many fake paintings are in their collection, uh, uh, there will be some force that I mean, there's the Nodler. There are many examples of fakes getting into the hands of private collectors, and when money is thrown around, it'll matter. And perhaps in the legal framework, they'll say, "Wait a minute, you didn't use the best computer methods for analyzing this painting gallery before you sold it. I'm going to sue you." I mean, maybe. I don't know.
Cool.
I just convinced that, 10 to maybe 20 years from now, everyone in art history will do something with computing. And it's not just going to be faster image search or, the traditional Google tools. It will be art specific, addressing specific art historical questions. Anyway, that's my life's mission now.
we almost hit the 2 hour mark. I have one last sort of like question, which may be a little bit out of left field, which is you've done a lot of things in computer vision, pattern recognition,
Yeah.
computation, optics, more general. Now you do this art thing. What do you think? Like, what would you be most enthusiastic about? Like, what haven't we seen yet? Will we see something like a radical reduction in the use of energy while doing what you do? Will we see completely new applications which haven't existed at all? Like what would you think is the most and the most 2001 thing we can expect in the next 10 years?
Let me answer that elliptically. One of the great joys of being the chief scientist of a major corporation is that we had a research lab, and if we had more budget, every research group knew exactly what they would do. Oh, the document analysis group would say, "Oh, we're going to improve our document analysis this way." And so, what you needed was someone at the top to say, "We should be working on that over there. Nobody's working on it. There's nobody inside who's working. We should look over there." And when I was charged to do that, I would come up with 60 different topic ideas. Each one fleshed out, here's the opportunities and stuff like this. It's hard to know what's coming on, but what worries me is that too many students are not trained to make problems, to identify new research areas. Because in certain countries, in certain Asian countries, you can go through entire college education and grad school education and really never ask a question. That your professor says, "Do this." Okay, do this, do this, do this. And then you become a professor, and either you do what you've always been doing, or you have great difficulty identifying new research areas. And so I feel incredibly blessed. My CEO at the time, Peter Hart, a very distinguished computer scientist, Shaky the robot, A-star algorithm, nearest neighbor algorithm, the first version of pattern classification, charged me with doing that. And it was a great opportunity. And I would turn to every professor there, including you, and say, when you have a dissertation, make sure there's a chapter that you didn't set the direction on. In the first chapter, do this. Second chapter, chapter 3, student, you come up with a research topic. It's hard. And so rather than tell you exactly where I should do more thinking about those directions, I would just say, I have been blessed to have had that training and feedback and experience. We should have more people who do it because it's really important, especially for your own career. That just doing the same thing and extending it is not your students are going to live for 50 years of career after they graduate, and you have no idea. I have no idea. Nobody has any idea 50 years from now. Anyway, I realize I didn't really answer your question, but I put it in context.
No, that's really good. I think there is a sort of I think this mining for ideas is a really, really important thing, which is indeed underestimated. And like, I remembered, like, as you were telling this story, like one of the most satisfying emails I ever got from a student was in Texas. It was a freshman student, and sort of 3 years later, I got the email where he said, "You know what? You asked me to come up with a research topic. Nobody ever asked me to ask a question.
No, it's insane. It's absolutely.
I hated you while it was happening for weeks, but now I understood this is like the most important thing that happened. And I think that is sort of something which, indeed, we need to allow. And it's like what we have done here the last 5 years, indeed, was this combination of, like, subject domains and methods, and have people systematically going out of their way in order to get to this sort of like what Uri Alon calls the cloud of uncertainty, where they can find out something new. But this is obviously, it's hard work, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, when I hire, if we have time, I just 2 minutes.
Yeah, sure.
When I hire people for my research lab, in the past, I won't be doing much of that going forward, maybe. I will put down, you know what Sudoku puzzles are. Mm-hmm. I'll put down a Sudoku puzzle, and the students think, oh, he wants me to solve it. No. I ask you, do you know what a Sudoku? Oh, everybody knows what it is. I say, ask a question about Sudoku. I don't care if you can answer it. Ask a good question. And they say, like what? And I say, well, like, how many ways can you put a 1 through 9 in each row, each column, and each 3 by 3 square? And he says, oh, I couldn't solve that. I said, I don't care if you could solve it. I want if you can come up with that question. And he says, all right, now he gets it. And I say, all right, now ask me another question. And if he says, like what? Again, there's no chance I'll hire this person. But on a plane ride back from Japan one time, I wrote down, I think it was 32 questions about Sudoku. And then if someone's that good, and I consider myself really good at this task, then the next question is, which is the best question? If you were going to spend the next 3 years of your career, which of those 32 questions should you work on, and why? Yeah. And my hero is David Hilbert, the mathematician who in 1900 came up with, I think it was 22 questions about mathematics that drove the field for many, many decades. I mean, think about it. Some of them are still not solved. In whatever field you choose, name me a good question now that will be important 100 years from now. It's hard. It's really hard. But he did it. I think he's the best question asker in the history of scholarship. And I started a book on how to ask questions, but I'm too busy with the art book. Anyway.
Yeah, super cool. I'd like to underscore this. I just bought a copy of the 1921 version, 7th edition of the Foundations of Geometry. I'm still looking if somebody has one for the Intuitive Geometry by Hilbert. I think it's really fantastic. How clear he sort of like lays out stuff. It's really amazing. One thing I would like to add to what you just said, I learned something very similar from my postdoc advisor, Dirk Helbing, who said, come up with 100 ideas, get rid of the 90 not so good ones, and in the top 10, think about which are the 8 you can wait for other people doing it, so you don't need to compete for that, and concentrate on the 2 questions that you need to solve because nobody can or would do them. And I think this is sort of something which is easy to say for people like Dirk Helbing or for you, like coming up with 60 questions, but most people don't have 60 questions. They don't have 100 ideas. So
well, it's because we're not teaching it and we don't tell them how important it is. Yeah. I think if we did, I mean, I have so many students here at Stanford who are really smart and stuff. And if you told them this, your grade depends on coming up with I think they would. But
Okay.
nowadays, professors don't. And that's shame on the professors, my view.
Excellent. So next week, I need to talk a little bit about that.
Oh, yeah.
And next week, there is no Open Lab seminar because it's national holiday here in Estonia. But in 2 weeks, we will have on March 2, Olivier Morin, who is a CNRS researcher, formerly Max Planck at the Institut Nicot at École Normale Supérieure. And he will talk about the evolution of writing and about how well designed are languages and other tools for communication. So this is sort of like a less visual one, but interestingly, there is a bridge to art history, which is Olivier has a sort of long tradition on working on quote unquote tradition, which in art history is the biggest question: where does it come from and how does it develop, right? And so, yeah, thank you very much, David. This was amazing and
A great pleasure.
super cool to catch up. Thank you.
Absolutely. Good luck to everybody. And feel free to email me. I'm very easy to find, dstork@stanford.edu.
Excellent.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.